Well, welcome to our webinar Wednesdays for Create Good. Thank you so much for joining today. Thank you so much for taking time today and expanding your skill set as a nonprofit communicator. Certainly all the people and the missions that you work on really need us to take this time to expand our learning. And these are repeat presentations from our previous sessions at Create Good. So Create Good is a national conference that brings together nonprofit communicators from all over the country in the spring of each year into Durham, North Carolina. So Chris was an amazing speaker that we had last year, and he is here for a repeat performance of his inclusive branding presentation, which was a real winner. And so we're really thankful for that. But every year we bring together around 200 nonprofit communicators from all over the country to Durham to really discuss and expand our minds around this important work. And it's just a really great, fun conference. It really is what I think, I'm biased, of course, but it really is the best conference for nonprofit communicators, specifically around communications, and it's just a fantastic gathering. And you can learn more about that at creategoodconference.com. And I'm Dawn Crawford from BCDC Ideas. We get to host Create Good every year, and it's an amazing opportunity for us to give back to the community. And we're so thankful to be able to do that. So I'm going to pass the presenter baton to Chris, and he can take it away.
Thank you, Dawn. So as we're going through the presentation today, please feel free to leave comments, questions, anything you want to add to the conversation in the chat room. I'll be trying to sneak a peek when I can, and Dawn and the team are also going to be monitoring it as well, so we can make sure to answer any questions that you might have as we go through this. And this topic is really important to me, this topic of inclusive branding, and I'll get to why and give a little more introduction about myself. But first, my name is Chris Tuttle, and I'm a digital strategist helping nonprofits use digital more effectively to increase awareness and drive constituent engagement and ultimately organizational impact. And I do this with website, email, social media, text message, chatbots, live streaming, AI, webinars like this. We try to help nonprofits understand how to use digital better. And while that may seem a little far removed from today's topic, the two go hand in hand in that digital is by and large the way that most of our organizations are communicating with constituents today. And thinking through how we're creating those communications, how we're expressing and sharing and implementing our brand in a way that's going to be inclusive, of course, is incredibly important for this work. So let me back up and talk about why this is important with me with a little personal backstory and some embarrassing photos to boot. So these are photos of me growing up in Irmo, South Carolina in the 80s. Irmo, South Carolina then was a small town, really a magnet town, a magnet school for the neighboring farm towns. And today is largely a suburb and a mall for Columbia, South Carolina. Back then, we celebrated Okra every year in the annual Okra Strut. And we'd get together and take pictures with okra, big blow up okra, and people would paint their faces green, and we'd have a big parade down Main Street. It's the thing you do in the South is every Southern town has to celebrate some vegetable once a year. And I largely loved growing up in South Carolina, except that I was a bit flamboyant as a young child, still am. Today we just call it queer. And I was largely made fun of and picked on throughout my childhood because I was flamboyant and expressive and emotional as a young boy. And I was also picked on because while you can see the flamboyance in these photos, you may not see the left shoulder on the right side of this picture since we're looking at it. But my left shoulder is largely, it looks slightly different. It's largely invisible. And this is an invisible disability that I've grown up with my entire life through a birthing issue where the doctor broke my arm during labor. And my left arm today remains largely paralyzed and immobile. But for the average viewer, most folks wouldn't necessarily see it or notice unless they see me try to catch a ball or try to do a jumping jack or try to roll down the window at the drive-through. Back when we had to roll the window down, I couldn't do it with my left arm. The weirdest thing. The ways in which the world was created, the world was not built for people like me. And the world was not built for people who didn't have full abilities and access to both arms and usage, or frankly, anybody else with a disability. Nor was the world built for this young, flamboyant queer kid growing up in Irmo, South Carolina. And these differences of mine played on early on in school as I faced harassment and bullying, and largely had a difficult time finding myself and fitting in a world that I didn't see including me. Thankfully, as I survived high school, it was largely due to two best friends, mutual dorks and geeks like me. And this is our I think it was our junior year picture. We had to go to Sears and do a friend portrait because why not? It's the 80s, right? And on the right-hand side, you'll see what really brought us together, in that we had this amazing friendship that was founded on difference, and that we each, in different ways, Kelly being a child of a preacher, Peggy being an Asian immigrant, and myself being queer and with a disability, largely felt ourselves excluded from larger communities in our school and in our neighborhoods. And so we bonded together and founded our own community of friends. And with that came this discussion about differences of culture and opinion. And from that was birthed a newspaper. And so in our junior year, we created the Irmo Sound Off, where the three of us decided to somehow talk businesses into sponsoring us to pay for these print jobs that we did at Kinko's at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then would like deliver 2,000 copies to all the neighbors. We were a little weird, but we wrote this amazing 12-page newspaper once a month for about a year, and shared our opinions and really debated and disagreed with each other about different issues that were hot topics, from gay marriage to immigration to even choice and abortion. So the newspaper layout is what brought us together and was really my first entry into communications work and working and writing. And it continued over the years, in large part as I moved to New York City in '99 to be the first national student organizer for an organization called GLSEN, which works to create safe and inclusive K-12 schools for LGBTQ youth. And as their national student organizer in those first years, I created national campaigns like the National Day of Silence and No Name Calling Week and Ally Week and GSAs in middle and high schools around the country. And that work was great. And I went on and did some other work with consulting with some companies, and then most recently returned to GLSEN as the director of communications the last 3 years. And now leading a communications and marketing team at this organization where I had initially done this work in a way of trying to include those who were often excluded in communities around the country. I now had a role from a communications perspective and as a communications lead to continue ensuring our organization was being inclusive and reaching those we weren't yet reaching. I recently left there to start my agency working on digital strategy called Tuttle Co. And that's what led me to start talking about this as a topic for nonprofits and thinking through what our brand is, whether our brand is inclusive, and how we can work to make our brand more inclusive. So to get us on the same page, what is a brand? A brand is an overall experience of a constituent that distinguishes itself, an organization, from others. The overall experience a constituent has and it distinguishes your organization from others. So of course it's the look, it's the feel, it's the words we use, the imagery, the color scheme, the fonts, the logo, the margins, it's all that wonderful stuff. But it's also the feeling people have about our organization. It's what they say about us when we're not in the room. It's how they feel when they get our next appeal. And it's whether or not they trust us. All of these things are our brand. And our brand is also whether or not people see us, or see themselves, in us. So organizations that don't have inclusive branding are going to risk advancing their mission only for those that are least impacted by their issue. Impacted nonetheless, but not necessarily as much as those who might sit at the margins of multiple marginalized identities. So thinking of myself even as an example of somebody who's a queer person of color, but also has a disability. And if our organization working with, ask myself as a queer person and a person with disabilities, if I was an organization working with queer people and we were only pushing out marketing that showed queer people who were fully able-bodied, then as a queer person with disabilities, I'm also not going to see myself in that organization. Now take that to the next step of whether or not our events are physically inclusive, whether or not the staff, the board, the speakers, the photos, the video interviews are inclusive, whether or not the policies we're advocating for are thinking through the impacts on different marginalized communities. All of these things can be more complicated when folks live at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities. So some considerations that we started thinking through at GLSEN, an organization already focused on working with LGBTQ young people. We started thinking, of course, how do we work better with LGBTQ young people of color, young people with disabilities, young people with other identities that might further marginalize themselves, even within our own LGBTQ community. And one of the first considerations that we came to was around colorblindness, and that it's something that we realized was often overlooked. And as you may have already noticed from that GLSEN palette you saw a minute ago, the GLSEN colors were very vibrant, and there was a lot of color that we used in a lot of our design. We also created a lot of research, and it was actually working with Dawn and BCDC Ideas that led to this session being created, in that when we had shared with them our style guide, we had included considerations for colorblindness when using our brand colors. And the reason why, for those who don't know, is about 10% of Americans experience some type of colorblindness. There's a lot of different types of colorblindness, and some types of colorblindness could prohibit a user, a viewer, from seeing two different things that had two different colors because they would look as if they were the same color. As an example, this could be text that's on a background color, or this could be a pie chart with different colors for different slivers of information. So you can see here in some of the data that we were using color for in different ways that we started wanting to make sure we're going to be accessible to folks who experience different types of color blindness. And I will say I think there's 6 or 8 types of color blindness. And so it's very difficult to try to ensure that every single design is always going to be perfectly readable, much less actually look good to different people with different types of color blindness. But there are some also common types of color blindness that we can address and look towards. And so this is what GLSEN ended up coming up with. What you'll see here in our first palette of colors are the GLSEN brand colors. And what you see below it are the 8 different common types of color blindness that our colors might appear to somebody that were put through a filter. And so there's some tools online that can help you find this. And I've included a link down below at tuttle.link/simulator, where you can add your own colors. In this case, I just added an image that included our 6 brand colors. Or you can add a screenshot of your website, a screenshot of a report from a PDF, or another image, and you can see what it might look like to people with different types of color blindness. We went so far to include this in our style guide because we wanted to ensure that our staff and all staff working within the communications team, but also our vendors, our partners, and others that might be utilizing our brand were taking this into consideration as well. While we were happy that we found that we hadn't had any major faux pas in our usage of the brand so far, and that you can see it here in the second column and the second example, the gold and what we called our lime green were the 2 that we typically would have the most problem with. And so we stopped using those colors in combination together, and it became a part of our brand rules. This also, of course, led us to think through what are other things in the communications department that we can and should be doing to ensure that we're creating a more inclusive organization and a more inclusive brand. And the second piece we came to was visual representation, and that the organization had historically used a bunch of stock photography, in large part because of the difficulty and complexity of getting photos of young people around the country when we as an organization were based here in New York City. But we have a chapter network, and we had folks in the field working in different communities, and we had access to photographers at youth conferences. And so while I was there, we initiated a visual representation inclusivity project in which we traveled to 4 conferences a year, in which we could set up photo shoots, and we would engage between 10 and 20 young people at each photo shoot, sometimes a few adults to play as educators as well. We'd pay them with Amazon gift cards as a thank you. We'd of course have to ask for them to volunteer, get their permission, but we set a new standard by doing this, and that our goal at each shoot was to get 100 quality photos that the network could share. We wanted 10 of them to be mainstream reservable photos that would be really, really high quality, that we would reserve to use on the front of publications and other things where we wouldn't want them used more frequently. And then the rest became like an open lottery box, basically a picket box that we could go and pick an image whenever we needed one for a blog post or an event or an article that were permissioned, that were licensed, and that were owned by us. This ended up instituting a new rule with over 400 photos a year coming out of this, that we had a new rule that stock photography was no longer allowed, and that it did not accurately represent the youth who we worked with. We can also think through visual representation in other ways, and that not just who are we using in our photos, but who are we using in our storytelling? Who are we using in our campaigns? Whose stories are being heard? And so some examples here that I really love, starting at the left. One is the Reeve Foundation for Christopher Reeve, and they've been doing an amazing job for over a year now with showcasing actual people and letting people speak through their Instagram account. And so you can go follow their posts and follow their stories, and you can see the different folks who they're including in these storytellings and ensuring that folks of all different types are part of this conversation. And you can see in the second example, Advocates for Youth, which always does a brilliant job of representation. This video is, I think, brilliant in multiple ways, and that if you can't see clearly, it's somebody who's signing in a video, and Advocates for Youth does a lot of sex education for young people. And you can also see there's a text overlay. So already we have, for folks who can sign, this is now something that they can see. However, what I love most about this isn't a video for deaf people. This is a video for the general public. Because why should only speaking people be the ones who actually share our information and educate our communities? Because everyone in our communities are not always speaking. So again, not necessarily creating representation just to serve specific communities, it's including and ensuring representation to serve all of our communities. On the right-hand side, we'll see another example from GLSEN. This was a campaign we did to protect trans youth in high schools around the country last year as the federal government seeked to reverse previous trans-inclusive policies. And so this is a campaign that was actually done with a trans student working with GLSEN and our partners at the Movement Advancement Project at the time. And so there was a series of visual content we do here as well. Other places that we think about visual representation were beyond photos, but within the imagery that we create and use. So in the LGBTQ community, we have a rainbow flag, which I suspect most people are probably familiar with by now. You may not know there are dozens of other flags for other communities within the LGBTQ plus community. And so one of the things at GLSEN, an organization working with LGBTQ youth, that we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that all of those different really sub-communities and other communities within our community also saw themselves in our work. And so we would often use different visual designs that were very inclusive of multiple or different rainbow flags. You'll also see this throughout our iconography, our use of imagery of people. Over the years, we've adopted this and adapted this in different ways to try to be more and more inclusive. What you may or may not notice here is we have somebody down in the Breaking the Silence graphic wearing a hijab. You actually have in the pride flag graphic, you have a couple different things. Our graphic designer here was absolutely amazing. And they put a couple different things in there, including the third arm, which is actually an appendix. And so it's something that we didn't actually talk about. It's not necessarily visible to folks, yet we actually found folks who had disabilities of different sorts actually noticed it. They saw it. as did Native American folks who noticed both the flag, but the combination of the jewelry on the fourth arm. And so just thinking through the little ways that we can reach out to folks and ensure that different communities are seeing themselves in our work. And this is all done by talking to people in those communities and asking them for feedback on our designs, for feedback on how we can do more, and feedback on what they would like to see. So I'm going to stop for 1 second here and just take a question, because I do see one. Actually, I see a couple questions, so I don't want to get too far ahead of this. So what was the decision process like to put a "do you agree" poll on the trans safety IG story? I noticed that 7% said no, which feels like, that's a great question. It was a conversation that we had internally quite a lot. We were really unsure at first whether or not we wanted to do it. However, that was one of the best responses we had seen. We went through an informal process, actually talking with our own staff, who included folks with trans identities as well, about whether or not we wanted to do it. And it was at a time around Pride that we really used Pride to show visibility. And we came to an agreement that we were going to try it. And so long as we saw a majority approval, that we would leave it, because especially this was several years ago, majority approval on trans issues is a good thing, and still is. I would actually still say 7% was incredibly low negative-wise. We used to get, and I think if you go on social today, you'll still unfortunately see it, that negativity on trans issues has actually increased even more since then. The other question I see in here was wondering if it's still a best practice to describe imagery on social media for audience members who are visually impaired. Absolutely. I'm going to get to that in a second, so I'm going to hold that and move on here. Dawn or anybody else, if I missed any other questions, just let me know. And thank you, Natasha, for the Big Bird bicycle shout out. I do love that photo. My mom made the Big Bird head, not me. It was for a Halloween bike costume contest in the neighborhood. So let's move on from visual representation and talk about captioning. So thank you so much. I think that was Erin. Perfect segue. Captioning in videos and even images is something that we should all be thinking about doing. I think it's something that most of us have heard we should be doing by now, but maybe we don't know how to do it. We're not sure when or which way we should do it, or we're just not getting around to it because we don't have enough time. Whatever these reasons are, we have to address it. And this is something that I've worked to ensure different organizations I'm working with, that we make it part of our standard procedure and policy that no video goes out without captioning. Now, sometimes, especially with live video content, you might need to actually, or be in a situation where you do post live without captions, but you go back afterwards and enter them for folks who are viewing long-term. Even that is going to be better for folks who can't see any captions at all at any time. So captions are great on videos for a couple different reasons, and you can use inline captions or overlay captions. So overlay captions are when you see on your TV screen or a YouTube video, when you turn closed captioning on or off. And overlay captions are actually going to use a file that you can import, or if you upload a video to YouTube, YouTube will auto caption it. There's some other tools out there on the web that can do it as well. Inline captions have to be actually designed on the video while you're editing the video. And you'll see on Facebook in particular that inline captions are often preferred and used by a lot of folks, Instagram, Facebook, and some other social networks. And the large reason for that is because videos will start playing in mute as you start to scroll past them. And if people can read what the person is saying, they're going to be more likely to either unmute it or stay a little bit longer and watch. So in this case, captions not only help those who can't with different audible disabilities, but they also help folks who are just using mobile devices. So again, living in a digital world. Image descriptions is the secondary piece to this. And so image descriptions are alt text on an image that you add to your website, and that's alternate text that will be read out by a screen reader if somebody's using a screen reader to access content on a website. And so part of this is just ensuring that content that's actually in an image is accessible to people who need to see it. Particularly important if we're showing information that's not also accessible via text in the narrative of the page, like a statistic and a pie chart that's pulled out, But if those stats and numbers aren't shared elsewhere in text, then people using screen readers won't be able to see or access that data. So alt text can be used there, but image descriptions can also be used on social media. And one thing most folks don't even know is Instagram has alt text or image descriptions built in. On every single post you make on Instagram, you can go under the advanced tools and add an image description so that people with visual disabilities can access visual content on Instagram just like the rest of us. So that first way I said around using image descriptions was ensuring that people can access the content. The other way is gorgeous photos like this. It's just ensuring that people can actually participate in social content, which is heavily visual in the same way that the rest of us can. Another consideration that I was thinking through during my time at GLSEN, and one that I thought lent itself well to this, is that branding is so often about doing the same exact thing, the same exact way, multiple times over and over long term. So people recognize our brand, they recognize our logo, they know our mission, they can say our tagline. And while that is true, brand is about consistency and doing the same and staying on our message and on point. There is also room for diversity within our brands, and there should be room for diversity within our brands. And so one way that we thought about this at GLSEN, an organization that was working with students and educators, but also has the foremost and largest body of research on the LGBTQ youth in the world, and works with professionals and the National Education Association, and that we wanted to allow our student organizing team and our executive staff to all be able to share the organization in a way that still was on brand, but also represented them and was best for their communities or their own personality. So we created a few different branded business cards and allowed folks to actually pick their own business card colors. And including these, over the years, they could even get multiple colors so they could share different ones out. We also thought through deeper audience profiling, in that a lot of our organizations are using audience profiles when we're designing a website or thinking through our donor strategy, our donor cultivation strategy, or doing outreach to volunteers. And if you're like the typical nonprofit in the United States, if you're thinking through your donor outreach strategy, you're going to keep coming back to 25 to 55-year-old women who are white living in suburbs. And that's not going to allow us to tap those audiences and reach those communities who we're not already seeing as the typical audience profile. When we're doing campaigns, we're often focusing on 3 primary audience groups. And while we can focus on students, often if we're focusing on young students in high school, we're most likely going to be thinking about the suburban white students who are heterosexual and cisgender and probably middle class. And those might be the majority of people who our specific programs even serving. But it's probably not all we're serving or should be serving. So deeper audience profiling is thinking through the various communities that we each work with. And it's identifying the primary communities, but also the subgroups and sub-communities within each of those primary who we might include and reach out to. And then next up on the list was accessibility. Now, this wasn't just accessibility of access via an impairment, a visual or physical impairment, but accessibility via tech. In that different generations, different people with different abilities, and people with different experiences are all going to use technology in different ways. And so one of the things we can also think about when thinking about the audiences we're serving and the communities we're reaching and who we're not reaching is think through how digital, how technology might help make us more accessible. This could be as simple as ensuring that somebody is checking our Facebook messages every day to respond people who have help questions, but who prefer for one reason or another to go through a Facebook message. Or it can be as complex as the Trevor Project, an organization doing suicide prevention and a national hotline, launching its new text-powered suicide prevention hotline. Planned Parenthood likewise has text messaging Q&A, is also using Tumblr, which I think is brilliant, as a way to allow young people to ask questions anonymously about sexual health and other support questions they may have that can then be published as public questions and answers. So what is the technology that we're using today to reach folks? And is there technology that would enable us to be more accessible to our constituents that we could be implementing? And there's a lot more. Those image descriptions that we talked about on Instagram can be put within the image description advanced functionality setting or field. They can also just be written to the body of your description. And you'll often see this done on Facebook, LinkedIn, and sometimes even as a follow-up tweet on Twitter. Website accessibility. So I think most of us have probably heard about in recent years some of the changes that are happening around website accessibility needs and standards. There's been a lot of lawsuits that are happening lately for businesses whose websites are not accessible per federal guidelines. So if it wasn't a priority for us before, it should be a priority for us now. It's only a matter of time before some eager lawyer might sue a nonprofit, or worse, somebody who actually needs something can't get their information on our website, that we need to focus on website accessibility standards and ensure that we're meeting the federal guidelines and taking it beyond that to meet the W3C school standards of accessibility, which are more advanced than federal guidelines. You can also, if you don't know about your website, visit W3C schools accessibility, and you can also find some checkers that will help you review your website and see what problems might be easily fixable. Thinking through resource formats. So many of us use PDFs on our website to make things look designed a certain way so that when it's printed out, it looks great on print. But PDFs aren't going to be accessible to folks with low tech bandwidth areas, folks who are in rural communities, possibly without internet, who might still be on 2G networks, especially if they're out of the US or in places with limited cellular networks too. PDFs are also not going to be the best format for folks with older computers, and they could incredibly slow down and be difficult to use for folks with visual impairments because they're hard to zoom in and out on. And depending on how your PDFs were created, they may not be properly formatted for screen readers. So thinking through how are we putting our content out there? Is our web page accessible? Is it on the web page? Is it a PDF? Is it a Word document? Are those documents accessible? And in what ways are they not? Thinking through languages we use on our website, social media posts, but also our style of language. So we all know language evolves. We've seen it in our lifetimes, and language obviously continues to evolve because I don't know half the words I hear young people say anymore, which now makes me one of those old geezers that I used to laugh at. But it's true, language is changing. And so the way that we're speaking about our work and speaking as an organization is going to impact who reads and sees our content. And so thinking through not how to do this in a way that's just trying to appeal to a younger market and try to be hip or cool, because obviously that will be seen through, but finding folks who can speak to folks about your issue in different ways. Talking about physical accessibility, of course, at our events, all gender restrooms. This is still something, just getting personal for a second, as a queer person, when I go into spaces and I see all gender or gender inclusive restrooms, they're not just for trans folks, they're for all of us. And when I see that, I instantly know that this is a place, a community that is more accepting and is more welcoming. And even if it may not be perfect, I know they're making an effort to try to ensure everyone is welcome and included here. So thinking through how all gender restrooms both provide access to all folks regardless of their gender identity, including non-binary people, but also are inclusive spaces in general. And then finally, training and support provided. So one of the biggest things we left at our conversation at Listen with after starting some of these communications inclusive branding topics was, how do we keep this going? Because this isn't done. Like, it's not like we're just inclusive now. We didn't fix every problem we've ever had. How do we continually evolve, and how do we find other areas we need to do better? And how do we put processes in place that will make this easier and more standard and more common for all staff to be thinking through and doing these things? And so that comes with training and support. And of course, there's various ways of doing this, but without support for our network and helping each other get better at this, none of us will. Remember that inclusivity is not something to be achieved, it's something to be practiced. And you can practice inclusivity in our organizations by reviewing your style guide and looking through what direction we give folks, both in what not to do with our brand, but also what should be done with our brand to ensure we're being inclusive. Think through our policies and our handbooks. I've seen so many organizations who have policies and handbooks that are really a list of warnings of what not to do, instead of a supportive guide to how to be great at this job. And so there's a couple things with this. One, think through the different policies we have around staff usage of different social media and other digital channels. And that if we are telling folks not to do certain things, like be on social media, then they're not going to be on social media talking about our organization or our work. And so we've just cut off our biggest brand ambassadors from talking about what we do. And part of that, unfortunately, often limits people who work in programs and other non-communications department roles from engaging directly with some of our community members. And so find ways to update, of course, our policies and handbooks, but also our procedures for how we involve all of our communities in our communications work, so that it's more community-driven, community-led, and it will be inclusive from the get-go. And there will be policies and handbook policies that will dictate that in our organizations. We created a training of trainers or speakers who actually are people who actually talk about this and help staff who are coming in get on board. We created a new onboarding process for staff in the communications team where we walked through how we work as a team and how we work to constantly be inclusive. And we implemented something in all of our meetings, that inclusivity and brand inclusivity became a conversation we were having on a monthly basis to talk about what new things have arose that we need to address, or how something was being implemented that had already been started, like the business cards or the colorblindness and the new style guide. So with that, I'll wrap this up by saying, make it a habit of asking in your organization, who is this not reaching? Every post, every communication, everything can't be for everybody, but everybody should be able to see themselves in our work. And so with that, I'll look back into the chat room and see if we have some more questions. I did miss a few. Excuse me, let's back up here. Oh, so there's a question of whether or not I can link to the website accessibility links. That is it, yes, W3 Schools, thank you so much, AW. Will asks a question, do inline captions create an issue for people using screen readers? So people who are using screen readers will typically, are typically people who have a visual impairment. And so yes, they won't be able to read the captions if they're inline, which is why if you're gonna do inline captions, really overlay captions are also necessary because the overlay is closed captioning for people with those needs.
I don't know, Chris, like what was your big aha moment with this? What was one thing that you're really surprised in working on this for so long that still surprised you?
Oh my gosh, I think it was actually the colorblindness piece. It was, so I'm gonna admit something really personal here. When we started these conversations at Listen, it was part of an accessibility team working group that came together of staff from multiple departments. And I wanted to be a part of it because as somebody with a physical disability who always had issues with that in spaces I was in, I wanted to be a part of the conversation. And I think I was one of the few staff with a disability as well, a physical disability. And so, but I sat in that meeting and largely thought I was going to be giving suggestions that other departments could implement. that these were things that programs needed to do, that events needed to work on. And I wasn't thinking initially from a communications perspective until we started actually identifying different communities and different people who have different needs and what their needs were. And it was through that conversation. I mean, I'm a military brat. My dad was colorblind. I should have known this. I grew up with him and my stepfather talking about not being able to tell the lights, or they only know the lights from memorization, traffic lights, that is. But it was that moment, that aha of going through this and thinking about colorblindness. And I instantly went like, oh my gosh, our research. Can people see that? Can they read it? And so that was my aha. And it was obviously resulted in I think a pretty great update to the style guide, and something that we've actually found incredibly helpful and changed the way that we were using our color schemes.
Yeah, that definitely, because we get to see a lot of brand guides, working with a bunch of nonprofits over the years. And the colorblindness was definitely the one that stuck out, because it was like, that's really deep inclusion, right? That is like, it's getting real deep. So great.
Well,
I think you have some more questions.
Olivia has a question in here asking folks, and I was going to ask you all this as well, is, also share into the chat room if you have apps or tools or other considerations for inclusiveness in our branding that we should all think about, because of course there's a lot more. And so one of the questions Olivia asked was about recommendations for free captioning tools for video. And so I see Mixed Captions is coming in as a free app that you can use on your phone. That's the one I've heard of. I've also used Clip-O-Matic, but it's not free. So Caitlin, thank you so much. Yeah, Mixed Captions is the only one that I know off the top of my head that's free. A lot of them charge or have a fee of some sort, either per minute they transcribe. I know a lot of people who use, a lot of organizations that use professional transcribing services will also use Rev, R-E-V. They are a paid service, they're not free. You can always start, if you need a video transcribed, start by uploading it to YouTube. And YouTube has an automatic transcriber that will, depending on the auto quality and the accent, will also try to auto transcribe it, but then you can go in and edit it and make it work. Also, if anybody on this call, if you are folks who would be the ones transcribing videos, like creating those captions, I urge you to go Google YouTube. There's a lot of free videos on this about how to do it in a way that's going to be effective. Because the auto transcriber that YouTube uses is not going to always catch sentence style in the right way. And it might sometimes put too few words on a screen and go too fast, or too many words on a screen and go too slow. Because it's often doing it based on the speaker, not on the readability of the content. So there are ways to actually transcribe video content that are going to be more effective and easier for folks who are actually trying to access it that way. Likewise with image descriptions. Imagining you are describing the image to somebody sitting next to you, and you want them to draw what you see. You don't have to give every detail, but give the big picture. The colors, the larger text, the style. If there's an image of a person, briefly describe them. I also see Caitlin also sharing that Facebook also has free editable video captioning. Thank you, Caitlin. Oh, AW and Rachel, thank you for letting me know. I've not heard this about Rev. Does anybody else have an alternative? So a couple folks are saying in the chat room that Rev might have some worker exploitation issues or labor issues. Amara is another captioning tool I see. So this is awesome. I love seeing so much interest in the captioning. Terrific. Well, if there are no more questions, Dawn, I think we might be wrapped up.
Yeah, I think so too. I think we're good for the day, but thank you so much for sharing this content again. I heard that this presentation is getting retired. This is the very last time.
It is.
Not gonna come back to her?
Well, we're gonna have a version 2 on the topic, and we're gonna explore even deeper other ways to create inclusive branding.
Perfect. I like it. Very good. But yeah, so thank you so much, and everybody. Chris's contact information is here. He's an amazing resource for the nonprofit community, and we're all lucky that he's here. So thank you so much for being part of our corner of the world, Chris.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate it, and can't wait for Create Good conference. I actually want to echo what you said at the beginning. It's actually one of my favorite nonprofit conferences too. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on the webinar. It was a great experience, and I met so many great folks there, and I do hope to make it back very soon.
Good deal. Well, thank you so much. Everybody have a great afternoon. Bye.